The lawyer's hands trembled as he slid the manila envelope across the mahogany table. Vincent Torres, a small-time accountant who'd spent 15 years embezzling from his employer's company in carefully concealed increments of $5,000 here, $10,000 there, stared at the document that would change his life forever. $20 million. The number burned into his vision like a brand. But beneath it, in smaller print that made his stomach drop, were two words that would haunt him: outstanding debts. 20 million in assets, yes, but also 20 million in secret obligations to dangerous people he'd never heard of, payments due in 30 days, and a clause that made his blood run cold. If the debts weren't paid, the inheritor would be held personally responsible, and the creditors had legal rights to collect by any means necessary. Just 3 weeks earlier, Vincent had been sitting in his cramped studio apartment, eating instant ramen, and watching the news when the breaking story flashed across the screen. Jonathan Ashford, tech billionaire and founder of Ashford Industries, had died in a fiery helicopter crash off the coast of Monaco. The images were devastating. Twisted metal, Coast Guard boats, solemn-faced investigators. The business world went into mourning. Markets tumbled. Competitors released respectful statements. Vincent had barely paid attention. Jonathan Ashford existed in a different universe. The kind of person whose morning coffee probably cost more than Vincent's monthly rent. What Vincent didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Jonathan Ashford was very much alive, watching every news report from a private villa in the Seychelles, monitoring every reaction, every tear, every vulture circling his empire. Jonathan had spent 47 years building his fortune, and in that time, he'd learned that money revealed people's true nature faster than any conversation ever could. He'd been betrayed by a brother who tried to steal his patents, divorced by a wife who wanted half his fortune after a 2-year marriage, and undermined by a business partner who'd been selling company secrets to competitors for years. The helicopter crash had been elaborately staged, a dummy in the pilot's seat, remote-controlled descent, an explosion timed perfectly for maximum visual impact. The paperwork was immaculate. The death certificate signed by a doctor on his payroll. The dental records matched because they were his dental records, carefully provided months in advance. He'd even left DNA evidence, samples taken during routine checkups, and preserved for this exact moment. Jonathan Ashford was legally, officially, and completely dead, but his plan was just beginning. Before his stage death, Jonathan had altered his will in ways that no one could trace back to him. He'd spent 2 years researching, digging into the lives of everyone in his company, everyone who worked for him, everyone who claimed to be his friend. He wanted to find the worst person possible. Someone with secrets, someone with greed in their heart, someone who would be tested beyond their limits. Vincent Torres had caught his attention during a routine audit. Jonathan's private investigators had discovered Vincent's embezzlement scheme, followed the money trails, watched as this insignificant accountant siphoned off amounts that wouldn't be noticed for years. Jonathan had been impressed by the careful planning, the patience, the absolute nerve of it. This was someone who understood the value of money, who craved it enough to risk everything. Perfect. The will was simple. Vincent Torres, barely an acquaintance, someone Jonathan had maybe spoken to twice in passing during company events, would inherit a $20 million trust fund. No explanation given. Just a windfall that would seem like a miracle. But Jonathan had engineered something far more elaborate. The $20 million was real, sitting in accounts Vincent could access. The debts, however, were equally real and infinitely more dangerous. Jonathan had borrowed from loan sharks, organized crime figures, underground financiers, all under corporate shells that traced back to the trust fund. He created a web of obligations that would activate the moment Vincent claimed his inheritance. These weren't the kind of debts you could walk away from or declare bankruptcy over. These were the kind of debts that followed you, that found you in the middle of the night, that made people disappear. Vincent's first week as a millionaire had been intoxicating. He'd quit his job with a single text message to his supervisor, walked out of his apartment without giving notice, checked into a 5-star hotel, and ordered every expensive item on the room service menu. He'd bought a car, not just any car, but a silver Porsche that he'd dreamed about since college. He'd made appointments with real estate agents to look at penthouses. He'd called his mother in Miami and told her she'd never have to work another day in her life. The money felt infinite. $20 million. He'd done rough calculations. Even with conservative investments, he could live on $400,000 a year for the rest of his life without touching the principal. He'd won the lottery without buying a ticket. The first sign of trouble came on day 8. Vincent had been sitting in his hotel suite, browsing out listings online, when someone knocked on his door. Not the polite tap of housekeeping, but a heavy, insistent pounding that made the frame rattle. He'd opened it to find 2 men in expensive suits, faces hard as granite, eyes dead as a shark's. They'd introduced themselves as associates of the Volkov Group and asked if he was Vincent Torres, inheritor of the Ashford Trust. When he confirmed, they'd smiled without warmth and handed him a document. Payment due for $1 million. Due date 21 days. He'd laughed, assumed it was a mistake, some clerical error. But they provided contracts, agreements, documents bearing Jonathan Ashford's signature, legal papers that bound the trust fund obligations Vincent had never known existed. That was just the first debt. Over the next 3 days, 5 more groups appeared. The Castellano family out of New Jersey needed $3.2 million. A Chinese syndicate called the Red Lotus demanded $2.8 million. An Eastern European network wanted $3 million. A South American cartel expected $2.5 million. Smaller players, independent operators, they all came knocking. Each had legitimate paperwork. Each had proof of Jonathan Ashford's borrowing. Each made it clear that payment wasn't optional. Vincent had tried to contact a law firm that handled his estate, but they'd been maddeningly vague. The debts were legally tied to the inheritance. They explained. By accepting the trust fund, Vincent had accepted its obligations. It was all there in the fine print he hadn't read carefully enough. Jonathan watched it all unfold from his villa, multiple screens showing surveillance feeds from cameras his people had planted in Vincent's hotel room, his new car, even his clothing. The tech billionaire had always believed that pressure revealed character. Some people rose to challenges, found inner reserves of strength and ingenuity. Others crumbled, made desperate choices, showed their worst selves. He wanted to see which category Vincent fell into. Would the accountant try to run? Would he go to the police? Would he attempt to negotiate? Or would he do something truly desperate? Jonathan had placed subtle options in Vincent's path, breadcrumbs leading to different possible solutions, each choice revealing something fundamental about the man's nature. Vincent's initial panic had given way to frantic calculation. He'd sold the Porsche back at a significant loss. He'd canceled the penthouse viewings. He'd moved to a cheaper hotel. He'd started liquidating portions of the trust fund, paying off the smaller debts first, trying to buy himself time. But the mathematics were brutal. Even if he paid off every creditor, he'd be left with almost nothing. The $20 million would evaporate, leaving him worse off than when he'd started because he'd quit his job, burned his bridges, made promises to his family. The embezzlement money he'd hidden away might be his only remaining asset. But that was barely enough to survive for a few years, certainly not enough to pay these debts. 2 weeks after inheriting the fortune, Vincent sat in a dingy motel room in Newark, surrounded by ledgers and financial documents, trying to find a way out. The luxury hotels were gone. The dreams were dead. He was left with a deadline approaching like a freight train, and the growing certainty that he'd inherited not a fortune, but a death sentence. That's when he found the anomaly. Digging through the trust fund's transaction history, looking for any possible avenue to challenge the debts, Vincent discovered something strange. Several of the loans had been taken out after Jonathan Ashford's death. Not before. After. The dates didn't match. A loan from the Volkov Group dated 3 days after the helicopter crash. Another from the Red Lotus dated a week after the funeral. These weren't old debts. They were recent, impossible, fraudulent. Vincent's mind raced through the implications. Someone had been impersonating Jonathan Ashford, taking out loans in a dead man's name, funneling the debt onto an inheritance they knew would trap whoever received it. But why? Who would orchestrate something so elaborate? The answer crept into his consciousness slowly, almost reluctantly, because it seemed too insane to be true. What if Jonathan Ashford wasn't dead? What if this entire thing was a test, a game, some twisted billionaire experiment? Vincent had read about wealthy eccentrics who did strange things, fake their deaths, test their heirs, create elaborate scenarios to see how people behaved. If that were true, then everything made a horrible kind of sense. He'd started investigating, using skills he developed during years of covering up his embezzlement. Vincent contacted journalists who'd covered the helicopter crash, found inconsistencies in the official reports. The body had been too badly burned for visual identification. The dental records matched perfectly, too perfectly, some forensic experts suggested. The DNA evidence had been processed by a private lab, not a government facility. Witnesses to the crash were all employees of Ashford Industries or people who'd received sudden financial windfalls shortly before the incident. The Monaco authorities had closed the investigation with suspicious speed. Every detail that had seemed like a tragedy began looking like performance. Jonathan had been impressed. From his villa, watching Vincent piece together the truth, the billionaire felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine surprise. Most people would have accepted the situation, paid what they could, and run. Some would have gone to police, though that would accomplish nothing since the debts were legally binding. A few might have tried to negotiate with creditors, but Vincent had done something unexpected. He'd questioned the fundamental premise. He'd looked at the evidence and seen through the illusion. Jonathan had underestimated the accountant, assumed years of small-time embezzlement indicated limited vision. Clearly, he'd been wrong. But recognizing the con didn't solve Vincent's problems. Even if Jonathan Ashford were alive, the debts were real. The creditors were real. The danger was real. Vincent had 17 days before the first major payment came due, and he was no closer to a solution. That's when he made a decision that surprised even himself. If this was a game, he'd play it. If Jonathan Ashford was alive and watching, Vincent would give him a show worth watching. He used the last of his liquid funds to hire a private investigator, an ex-FBI agent named Sarah Morrison, who specialized in finding people who did want to be found. He gave her everything he'd discovered, every inconsistency, every suspicious detail. He told her to find Jonathan Ashford. Sarah was good at her job. Within a week, she'd traced shell companies and offshore accounts, followed money trails across 3 continents, interviewed boat captains in Monaco who remembered a helicopter that landed intact on a private yacht before the explosion, found immigration records that didn't quite line up. The trail led to the Seychelles, to a specific island, to a villa owned by a corporation that connected to 17 other corporations that eventually traced back to Ashford Industries. She'd sent Vincent photos, surveillance images showing a very much alive Jonathan Ashford sitting on a veranda, drinking coffee, watching multiple computer screens. The proof was indisputable. Vincent had felt many things in that moment: rage, relief, vindication, confusion. But mostly, he'd felt something unexpected: admiration. The sheer audacity of faking your own death, of orchestrating something this elaborate, of having the resources and vision to pull it off. It was almost beautiful in its complexity. Vincent understood then that he and Jonathan weren't so different. They were both willing to cross lines that most people never even approached. They both understood that rules were suggestions, that morality was negotiable, that the world belonged to people willing to take what they wanted. The difference was scale. Jonathan operated with billions. Vincent had been satisfied with thousands. But the fundamental psychology was identical. With 13 days left before the deadline, Vincent booked a flight to the Seychelles. He didn't tell Sarah his plans. He didn't contact the law firm. He simply packed a bag, withdrew the remainder of his embezzlement funds in cash, and flew halfway around the world to confront a dead man. The villa was exactly as Sarah had described it: pristine white walls, panoramic ocean views, security cameras everywhere. Vincent walked straight up to the front gate and pressed the intercom button. When a voice answered, he simply said his name and waited. The gate opened within seconds. Jonathan was waiting in his study, sitting behind a massive desk made of reclaimed shipwood, wearing casual linen clothes that probably cost more than Vincent's entire wardrobe used to be worth. The billionaire looked relaxed, almost pleased, as Vincent entered. He gestured to a chair without saying a word, studying Vincent with the intensity of a scientist examining a fascinating specimen. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Jonathan finally spoke, his voice carrying the faint trace of amusement. He asked if Vincent had figured it all out, if he understood why this had happened. Vincent responded that he understood perfectly. Jonathan Ashford had faked his death to test the people in his life. to see who would show their true colors when money and power were on the line. The inheritance and debts were a trap designed to reveal character under extreme pressure. Jonathan smiled, acknowledging that Vincent was essentially correct, though the full picture was more nuanced. The billionaire explained that he'd spent decades surrounded by parasites, family members who wanted his money, business partners who envied his success, friends who were only friends because of what he could provide. He'd lost faith in humanity's capacity for genuine connection. The staged death was meant to strip away pretense and show him what people were really made of. He'd set up similar tests for dozens of individuals, each tailored to their specific weaknesses and desires. Vincent's test had been about greed balanced against survival instinct. Most people in his position would have panicked, paid what they could, and tried to hide. Some would have gone to authorities and been crushed by legal technicalities. A few might have attempted to negotiate with creditors and ended up dead. But Vincent had done none of those things. He'd investigated, uncovered the truth, and come directly to the source. That showed initiative, intelligence, and courage that Jonathan genuinely respected. Vincent asked the obvious question, what happened now? Would Jonathan cancel the debts? Was this the end of the test? Jonathan's expression grew serious. He explained that the debts couldn't simply be erased because the creditors were real and expected payment. Jonathan had borrowed actual money from dangerous people, using it for legitimate business purposes before funneling it into obligations tied to the inheritance. The whole scheme had cost him considerable resources to set up. If Vincent wanted out, he'd have to either pay the debts or find another solution. Jonathan wasn't going to simply wave a hand and make $20 million in criminal obligations disappear. That would defeat the entire purpose of the exercise. Vincent felt his anger rising, but kept his voice controlled. He pointed out that Jonathan had essentially tried to destroy his life for some philosophical experiment about human nature. The billionaire had given him hope, let him believe he'd escaped the grinding poverty and fear that had defined his existence, then snatched away with impossible obligations that would likely get him killed. What kind of test was that? What could Jonathan possibly learn that was worth a human life? The billionaire's response was cold. He'd learned that Vincent Torres was a thief who'd stolen from his employers for 15 years, that he'd been perfectly willing to enjoy stolen money, that his first instinct upon receiving wealth was to spend extravagantly rather than invest wisely, that he'd abandoned his job and responsibilities without proper notice. Why should Jonathan feel guilty about testing someone who'd already proven themselves morally flexible? The words hit Vincent like physical blows because they were absolutely true. He'd been a thief. He had stolen. He had quit without care for the people he left behind. He'd been riding high on $20 million he'd done nothing to earn, money that appeared in his life through sheer chance. Who was he to judge Jonathan's methods when his own ethics were questionable at best? The two men stared at each other across the desk, and Vincent realized they were playing a game within a game. Jonathan wanted to see what Vincent would do now, how he'd react to being confronted with his own hypocrisy. Every moment was still part of the test. Vincent made a choice. He told Jonathan that he wanted to make a deal. The billionaire raised an eyebrow, interested. Vincent explained that he'd spent 15 years learning how to hide money, create false trails, manipulate accounting systems, and operate beneath the notice of auditors and investigators. He developed skills that might be valuable to someone like Jonathan, someone who clearly needed people capable of operating in gray areas. In exchange for erasing the debts, Vincent would work for Jonathan for 5 years, doing whatever financial manipulation or corporate espionage the billionaire required. He'd essentially trade one form of theft for another, but at least he'd be alive and working for someone who appreciated his particular talents. Jonathan considered the proposal for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Then he asked the question Vincent had been dreading. What made Vincent think he was valuable enough to warrant such a deal? Jonathan had hundreds of employees, many with far more impressive credentials and experience. Why should he hire an accountant whose greatest achievement was stealing pocket change over a decade and a half? Vincent's response was simple but honest. He explained that most of Jonathan's employees were too ethical or too afraid to do what really needed doing in the gray areas of business. They'd follow laws and worry about consequences. Vincent had already proven he'd cross ethical lines when necessary, and now that he understood the stakes of Jonathan's world, he'd be motivated to succeed in ways a typical hire never would. He had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. That made him dangerous in useful ways. The billionaire laughed, genuinely amused. He stood from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the ocean for nearly a minute before turning back to Vincent. Jonathan agreed to the deal, but with modifications. Vincent would work for him for 7 years, not 5. The $20 million trust fund would be dissolved and used to pay off creditors, meaning Vincent would start from nothing again. His salary would be modest by billionaire standards, $200,000 a year, which would seem like a fortune compared to his previous life, but would keep him hungry. Most importantly, Jonathan would still be officially dead for the next 2 years, while he continued his experiments and tests. Vincent would be the public face of certain business operations, taking risks that Jonathan couldn't take himself. If Vincent succeeded and proved trustworthy, after 7 years he'd receive a legitimate $20 million as payment for his services. If he failed or betrayed Jonathan at any point, the original creditors would be informed of his role in defrauding them, and they'd come for him with the full knowledge that Jonathan would offer no protection. Vincent agreed without hesitation, understanding that he was trading one trap for another, but at least this trap had a potential exit. They shook hands, and Jonathan made a phone call to his lawyers, setting the new arrangement in motion. Within hours, documents were being prepared, money was being transferred, creditors were being paid off with funds from the trust Vincent had briefly possessed. The Porsche he bought and sold at a loss, the hotel rooms, the extravagant meals, all of it had been a brief fantasy that evaporated like morning mist. But Vincent was alive. He had a job that would actually use his questionable skills, and he had a path forward that didn't end with him floating face down in a river. The first 6 months working for Jonathan were unlike anything Vincent had experienced. The billionaire ran his operations from the shadows, giving Vincent detailed instructions through encrypted communications, never appearing in person after that initial meeting in the Seychelles. Vincent became the point person for several shell corporations that Jonathan used to manipulate markets, acquire competitors, and fund projects that existed in legal gray areas. He learned how real money moved in the world, not the pathetic thousands he'd skimmed from his former employer, but millions that flowed through international banks, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency exchanges. Jonathan taught him techniques that made Vincent's previous embezzlement look like a child stealing candy from a convenience store. Vincent's first major assignment involved acquiring a biotech startup that was developing promising cancer treatment technology. The founders didn't want to sell, so Vincent's job was to make them desperate enough to accept Jonathan's offer. He studied their finances, found weak points in their investor relationships, and orchestrated a series of seemingly unrelated problems. Delayed shipments, lost permits, negative press coverage that appeared organic but was carefully planted. Within 3 months, the startup was hemorrhaging money and accepting buyout offers. Jonathan purchased it through a subsidiary for $30 million, less than its actual value. 6 months later, the cancer treatment technology was worth $500 million. Vincent received a bonus of $50,000, more money than he'd stolen in 15 years of embezzlement, earned in a single transaction. But the work took its toll. Vincent found himself lying awake at night, thinking about the researchers at that biotech company who'd lost their equity, the employees who'd been laid off during the manufacturer crisis, the patients who might have received treatment sooner if the acquisition had been handled ethically. He'd always rationalized his embezzlement as victimless crime. The company he'd stolen from was profitable, they'd never missed the money, nobody got hurt. But working for Jonathan showed him the cascading consequences of financial manipulation. Every action rippled outward, affecting lives in ways he'd never considered. The second year brought more complex assignments. Vincent helped Jonathan gain control of a media company by exploiting internal conflicts between board members. He facilitated real estate deals that displaced low-income residents from neighborhoods Jonathan wanted to redevelop. He manipulated stock prices through carefully timed information leaks that netted Jonathan tens of millions in profits, while other investors lost their savings. Each success brought more responsibility, higher bonuses, and deeper complicity in activities that Vincent increasingly struggled to justify. Jonathan remained a ghost, communicating only through intermediaries or encrypted messages. But Vincent knew he was being watched constantly, tested continuously. The surveillance cameras in his apartment were obvious once he knew to look for them. His phone was certainly monitored, his bank accounts tracked, every conversation potentially recorded. The billionaire trusted no one completely, and Vincent understood that one mistake, one moment of betrayal or weakness, would trigger consequences that would make the original debt trap seem merciful. The turning point came during Vincent's third-year service. Jonathan tasked him with destroying a journalist named Michael Bradley who'd been investigating Ashford Industries' business practices before Jonathan's death and had recently started digging again, asking uncomfortable questions about the company's current operations. Vincent was given a comprehensive file on Bradley, his finances, his relationships, his secrets, his vulnerabilities. The instruction was clear. Discredit him thoroughly enough that no one would believe anything he published about Ashford Industries or Jonathan's possible survival. Ruin his reputation, destroy his career, make him an example of what happened to people who asked too many questions. Vincent spent weeks studying Bradley's life. The journalist was 42, divorced, had a teenage daughter he barely saw because of a custody arrangement that favored his ex-wife. He lived in a small apartment in Brooklyn, drove a 12-year-old Honda, and survived on the modest income from freelance articles, since he'd been laid off from his newspaper job 3 years earlier. Bradley wasn't wealthy or powerful. He was just a man trying to do his job, investigating legitimate concerns about corporate corruption and financial crimes. Reading through Bradley's published work, Vincent realized the journalist had actually uncovered evidence of several genuine problems. Safety violations Jonathan's companies had covered up, environmental damage from a chemical plant, accounting irregularities that suggested larger fraud schemes. Vincent found himself unable to execute Jonathan's orders. For the first time since accepting the deal, he questioned whether survival was worth the price. He thought about the biotech researchers, the displaced residents, the investors who'd lost money because of his manipulations. How many lives had he damaged in 3 years? How many more would he damage in the remaining 4 years of his contract? And at what point did complicity in evil make you evil yourself, regardless of your justifications or circumstances? He made a decision that terrified him. Vincent contacted Bradley through an anonymous encrypted email, providing enough information to prove he was someone inside Ashford Industries with access to sensitive materials. He didn't reveal that Jonathan was alive. That would have been too dangerous, too unbelievable without substantial proof. Instead, Vincent leaked documents showing the ongoing corporate crimes, the shell companies, the manipulated deals, the pattern of corruption that had continued after Jonathan's death. He gave Bradley everything needed for the most comprehensive expose of corporate malfeasance in decades. Bradley published the story 3 weeks later. It ran in a major national publication, backed by irrefutable documentation that Vincent had provided. The article exposed illegal activities across multiple Ashford subsidiaries, triggered federal investigations, caused stock prices to plummet, and put several executives in legal jeopardy. The business world erupted. Regulators descended on Ashford Industries like wolves on wounded prey. Shareholders filed lawsuits. Competitors sensed blood in the water. It was exactly the kind of catastrophic exposure that someone like Jonathan had spent decades and billions of dollars trying to prevent. Vincent knew what was coming. He betrayed Jonathan completely, violated every term of their agreement, done the one thing that would trigger the most severe consequences. He considered running, but where could he go that Jonathan couldn't find him? The billionaire had resources that spanned the globe, connections in places that didn't respect law or borders, the ability to make people disappear without leaving traces. Running would just prolong the inevitable. So Vincent stayed in his apartment, watching the news coverage of the scandal he'd created, and waited. The knock on his door came at 3 a.m, 2 days after Bradley's article published. Vincent had been sitting in the dark, drinking scotch he'd bought with the last of his bonus money, preparing himself for whatever came next. He opened the door expecting hired thugs or assassins. Instead, Jonathan Ashford stood in the hallway, very much alive, wearing a tailor suit and an expression that was impossible to read. The billionaire walked past Vincent without being invited, moving through the apartment with the confidence of someone who already knew every inch of it from surveillance footage. He sat in Vincent's chair, looked around at the modest furnishings, and finally spoke. Jonathan said he'd been impressed. Vincent had passed the real test, the one that mattered more than all the others. The billionaire explained that the past 3 years hadn't been about testing Vincent's willingness to commit crimes or manipulate markets. Anyone could do that with proper motivation and instruction. The real test was whether Vincent would eventually recognize a moral line he wouldn't cross, whether he'd sacrifice his own safety for principle, whether greed and fear could be overcome by conscience. Most people fail that test. They convince themselves that survival justified anything, that following orders absolved them of responsibility, that they were victims of circumstance rather than architects of their own choices. But Vincent had chosen differently. He'd chosen to expose corruption, even knowing the personal cost. That was the quality Jonathan had been looking for all along. Vincent was confused, suspicious, unable to process what he was hearing. He asked if this was another game, another manipulation. Jonathan admitted it was, in a sense. Everything had been a test, layers upon layers of deception, designed to strip away pretense and reveal fundamental character. The inheritance and debts, the deal in the Seychelles, the 3 years of increasingly unethical work, all of it had been orchestrated to see who Vincent really was under pressure. Most of the corporate crimes Vincent had facilitated were legal, carefully structured to appear worse than they actually were. The biotech acquisition had been negotiated fairly before Vincent's intervention, his efforts just theater to make him believe he was doing harm. The media company deal involved willing sellers who wanted to exit anyway. The stock manipulations had been simulation exercises with fake accounts. Jonathan had created an elaborate fiction where Vincent thought he was committing serious crimes, when in reality he'd been participating in controlled experiments with minimal actual consequences. But Bradley's investigation was real. The documents Vincent had leaked were genuine. The crimes exposed in the article were actual violations that certain executives in Ashford Industries had committed without Jonathan's knowledge while he was playing dead. By leaking those documents, Vincent had done something Jonathan had been trying to do for months: expose corruption in his own organization that had taken root during his absence. Vincent had inadvertently helped clean house, removing elements that had turned cancerous while Jonathan was unable to act directly. The test had worked better than Jonathan had planned. Vincent felt his mind struggling to separate reality from performance. How much of the past 3 years had been real? How much had been theater? Jonathan explained that it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Vincent had proven himself trustworthy in ways Jonathan had almost stopped believing were possible. The billionaire was tired of his experiment, tired of being dead, tired of testing people and finding them wanting. Vincent's betrayal, his willingness to sacrifice everything for principle, had restored something Jonathan thought he'd lost. Faith, perhaps, or hope that genuine integrity still existed in a world where money seemed to corrupt everything it touched. Jonathan made a final offer. He was going to publicly return from the dead, claim he'd been in hiding after discovering corruption in his company, use Vincent's leaked document as evidence of why he'd faked his death and conducted his investigation from the shadows. The story would be elaborate, carefully constructed, legally defensible. Ashford Industries would undergo massive restructuring. Criminals would be prosecuted. The company would emerge stronger and more ethical than before. And Jonathan wanted Vincent to be part of that transformation, not as a manipulator operating in shadows, but as a legitimate executive helping to build something better. The salary would be $500,000 a year, with equity stakes that could eventually be worth tens of millions. The work would be legal, transparent, and genuinely focused on creating value, rather than extracting it through questionable means. Vincent asked why he should trust anything Jonathan said after 3 years of elaborate deception. The billionaire smiled and admitted Vincent shouldn't trust him, at least not completely. Trust had to be earned through actions over time, not granted because of words. But Jonathan was offering Vincent a choice that was genuinely free, with no hidden traps or consequences beyond those Vincent chose to create for himself. He could accept the job offer and help build something worthwhile, or he could walk away with $1 million payment for services rendered and never hear from Jonathan again. For once, the decision was entirely Vincent's, with no manipulation or pressure behind it. Vincent thought about the lawyer's office 3 years earlier, the moment he'd learned about an inheritance that seemed like destiny but turned out to be a trap. He thought about the creditors who'd appear with impossible debts, the fear that had driven him halfway around the world to confront a dead man, the deal that had saved his life but cost him his peace of mind. He thought about every manipulation he'd participated in, every line he'd crossed, every moment he'd felt his conscience crying out against actions he'd taken anyway. And he thought about Michael Bradley, the journalist who'd done his job with integrity, and how Vincent's leak had protected someone who deserved protection. He told Jonathan he'd accept the offer, but with conditions. Vincent wanted a formal ethics oversight board for Ashford Industries, independent auditors with real authority, whistleblower protections for employees, and transparent reporting on everything the company did. He wanted Jonathan to commit publicly to operating with integrity, not just privately while maintaining plausible deniability. If they were going to do this, they were going to do it right, or Vincent would walk away regardless of the money. Jonathan agreed without hesitation, even seemed pleased by the demands. They shook hands again, this time as genuine partners rather than manipulator and victim. The lawyer's hands had trembled when he delivered the envelope 3 years earlier, revealing an inheritance that came with impossible debts. Now, sitting across from Jonathan Ashford in his modest apartment at 3 a.m, Vincent understood that the trembling hadn't been nervousness about delivering bad news. The lawyer had been part of performance, an actor following a script, his trembling hands just another detail designed to make the trap feel real. Every moment had been orchestrated, every detail planned, every consequence carefully calibrated to test Vincent in ways he'd never fully understand. But somehow, impossibly, Vincent had survived, not by being smarter than Jonathan, because that would have been impossible, not by being luckier, because luck had nothing to do with an experiment this carefully controlled. He'd survived by eventually choosing to be better, by finding a line he wouldn't cross even when crossing it would have kept him safe. That choice had saved him, revealed him, transformed him from a small-time thief into someone capable of genuine integrity under pressure. As Jonathan left the apartment that morning, the sun rising over the city, Vincent looked at the manila envelope sitting on his table. He'd kept it all these years, a reminder of the moment his life had changed forever. $20 million in inheritance. $20 million in secret debts. The numbers that had seemed so important 3 years ago now felt almost meaningless. What mattered wasn't the money, the debts, the threats, or the opportunities. What mattered was discovering who you were when everything was stripped away except the choice to do right or wrong. Vincent had found his answer, learned it through fire and deception and fear. He was someone who would eventually choose principle over survival, even when the cost was everything he'd been working toward. The billionaire had faked his death to test his partners, his employees, everyone in his life who claimed to care about him. He'd wanted to see who people really were when they thought he was gone and couldn't reward or punish them. Vincent Torres, a small-time accountant and casual thief, had inherited $20 million in secret debt and somehow emerged from that trap not as a victim or a criminal, but as someone Jonathan Ashford actually respected. The test had worked, though not in the way anyone could have predicted. And in the end, both men had learned something valuable about the price of integrity and the possibility of redemption, even for people who'd long ago stopped believing in either.